Mother's Day, Father's Day, one day a year to say thank you. But parenting and caregiving, that's every day. Online therapy gives you a space to be heard, to process, to recharge. No commute, no guilt, just support that fits your life. You show up for them, now show up for you. Visit BetterHelp.com for 10% off your first month of online therapy. BetterHelp, therapy for the people who care for everyone else.
Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
The meeting in Alaska started with a walk down the red carpet, a military flyover, and a ride in the presidential limousine. The diplomatic pageantry made it easy to imagine peace could be close at hand.
I believe a peace agreement at the end of all of this is something that's very attainable, and it can be done in the near future.
But following the last weeks of whirlwind diplomacy spearheaded by Donald Trump, there's been little sign of progress toward ending the deadliest conflict in Europe since World War II. Russia has continued its bombardment of Ukraine, unwilling to cease its attacks or accept anything less than its maximalist goals in the war, dealing a blow to a president in his most significant attempt yet to stop the bloodshed.
Now, I'm not happy about anything about that war. Nothing. Not happy at all.
I'm Caryn Ceolin, and today on The Big Story, I'm joined by Oleksa Drachewych, an assistant professor of history at Western University and a lecturer in history at King's University College, to discuss where the recent diplomatic efforts will lead and whether peace is still possible. Professor Drachewych, really a pleasure to welcome you back onto the show. Thanks so much.
Well, thanks for having me on again.
This month, Trump held successive talks with Putin and Zelensky. If you can, just set the scene for us, bring us up to speed on these recent efforts to mediate an end to the war. What was actually achieved, I guess, now that this kind of whirlwind of diplomacy appears to have died down?
So what was actually achieved is an interesting question, because right now, at the end of the day, I keep sort of saying when people ask me, I'll believe things when I see them. There's a lot of talk and a lot of sort of show to a lot of this, but very little substance at this point. Probably the best way to put it would be this, is that we had first Trump's meeting with Putin in Alaska. And that, I think, gave a lot of people a pause, because it looked like Trump and Putin had sort of revived their past relationship, and that Putin said a lot of things that Trump wanted to hear, which made some people concerned that when Trump would then meet with Zelensky and European leaders the following Monday, that would then lead to a much more tense meeting than we actually saw. What I think people forgot, though, was Zelensky and Trump had largely repaired some of their relationship after that tense Oval Office meeting several months back, when they met at Pope Francis's funeral, when they met in Rome, or at the Vatican. And since then, you could see that at least there was some relationship there. And the sort of the feeling out of that Monday meeting was, okay, maybe there might be something here. We heard talk about security guarantees that, for example, even Trump was saying that there might be some sort of American presence in this, which was a notable thing to sort of add as well. And so there looked to be some at least positive momentum that maybe there might be something different. At the same time, very clearly during those meetings on Monday, Russian representatives immediately put cold water in any sort of security guarantee with any NATO countries involved, which suggested that maybe a lot hasn't changed at all. Trump at one point has then a call with Putin while those meetings are going on, and even within sort of that 24 hours, 48 hours, there's some messaging that came out of the Trump administration suggests it's going to be sort of tough going for anything of a sort of meaningful sort of change in terms of the peace process. What has happened in many cases is that Europe and Ukraine have clearly been working together on developing a security guarantee that Ukraine can live with, sort of as a way to put some pressure on Putin. Tomorrow, Ukrainian representatives are meeting with representatives of the Trump administration as well, presumably to get American buy-in onto what is being discussed with regards to things like security guarantees. And the hope is that, as Zelensky has even said, that this will keep putting some pressure on Putin. The problem is, as we've seen over the last couple of weeks, and this started especially in July, July being essentially the deadliest month in terms of Russian airstrikes on Ukrainian civilian targets since essentially 2022. It seems like the Russian forces are doubling down on terror strikes, on strikes. We just had another extremely deadly strike in Kyiv last night. And so there's a lot of sort of uncertainty about how serious Russia is on peace talks. I very much feel that until we see them actually make any sort of a shift, they are essentially playing the Trump administration, hoping to keep them sort of more aligned with themselves, with Russia, that is, while Ukraine is trying to say the right things to try to at least keep the United States either engaged, or if the United States is frustrated with Russia, they might then, for example, put on some economic sanctions, maybe free up some munitions, do more than just simply allow the sale of munitions to NATO countries to support Ukraine and maybe go further in their support of Ukraine.
We'll delve, of course, deeper into detail about the prospects around peace in just a moment. But I'm just wondering, because traditionally, ironing out details for things like security guarantees and other sticking points should have happened before the leaders got together. Trump, of course, did the opposite when he met with both warring leaders. I wonder, has momentum to secure peace stalled partly because Trump kind of flipped the diplomatic process on its head?
I think there's something to say about that. I think that the bigger issue is that there is no real momentum from a real desire from Russia to actually seriously negotiate. And that hasn't changed essentially since the early days of the escalation, where Russia largely tried to dictate a peace to Ukraine. And at that point, things still looked dire for Ukraine. For sort of 6 weeks after the escalation began, Ukraine held out. We then learned about the realities of Bucha. The West also stepped up in ways that, again, for those who saw how the West responded in 2014, when Russia invaded Crimea and the situation in Donetsk and Luhansk began, there was a real fear from Ukrainians that, okay, they're going to be left alone again, and there might be we take the best deal we can. What's clear is that those 2022 negotiations also still remain essentially the starting point for any negotiations for Russia, which also suggests that they want a lot more of the sort of that they actually have. I think fundamentally, unfortunately, the Trump administration really has not understood what Russia's trying to get out of this. And I think the other part to all of this is probably about April or May, both Zelensky and Putin and Russian officials, Ukrainian officials, learned how to deal with Trump. They had sort of those initial first couple of months where it was sort of very much the sort of back and forth. Again, we mentioned the Oval Office meeting where Zelensky was berated. But by April and May, both Zelensky and Putin learned to say the right things to get Trump on their side and have used essentially this sort of focus that the Trump administration has on peace to both maintain some at least focus on what's happening in Ukraine if you're Ukraine, but for Russia to try to, again, their goal is to split the United States from Europe, the transatlantic sort of partnership there. And if the United States becomes a frustrating partner, they're achieving that goal in that way. And I think that's far more of a factor in why nothing has happened, in the sense of you still have a Ukraine that doesn't see territorial concessions as necessary, won't accept territorial concessions. The population very much against it. You also have a Russia that refuses in any way to make any meaningful concessions. And so the problem is it's hard to start negotiations if there's no real pressure on one side or the other to actually cause some movement. And ultimately, there's also then the problem with Ukraine of we know the reality of Russian occupation. And so there's moral and ethical issues that make it more than just simply, well, we want peace. What about all those Ukrainians living under Russian occupation? That's a big part of this. And that issue of justice is something that also Ukraine and Europe have put front and center to some degree.
Is this part of the reason why Russia is refusing to set a meeting with Zelensky? Because, of course, we know Trump had expressed confidence that perhaps a Putin-Zelensky meeting was imminent, but statements from the Kremlin since suggest such a meeting is nowhere close to materializing. Is this why Russia is refusing to meet with Zelensky?
So part of it, for that specifically, they don't see Zelensky as a legitimate leader. They basically have delegitimized Zelensky. If you even look at the rhetoric when the escalation happened, they framed it as the Zelensky government has taken Ukraine down this terrible path. They're all Nazis, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They're all immoral. And if the Ukrainians were just freed from the yoke of the Zelensky government, they would see that their path is with Russia, and Russia could come in as saviors. And we've even just seen, even in the last week, that some Russian state television have revived sort of some statements to that effect, even claiming that the Russian forces in Ukraine are actually the peacekeepers already. So there's no need for a peacekeeping force. And that sort of thing is they have delegitimized Zelensky. This is why, for example, when Trump makes those comments about Zelensky needing to hold elections and he's not he's essentially a little dictator and things like this, it's playing right into Russian rhetoric. And ultimately, like if Putin meets with Zelensky, that is a big shift because that would suggest that there has to be then some acceptance of the Zelensky government. Putin and Russian officials have been very, very clear that they do not see that as the case, and a leader-to-leader meeting is not in the cards. If it happens, I would be shocked. It would be a notable sort of shift, but for that reason, again, if Putin has his way, it would be that Zelensky in some way is either removed or that there is a government that follows that would be much more willing to align itself with Russia in some way, shape, or form, and that's always been a key goal of this escalation.
Can you also perhaps just break down in detail kind of the preconditions Russia is attaching to a face-to-face meeting with Zelensky? Because I think they would almost certainly prove to be absolutely absurd to the Ukrainian side.
Yeah. So ultimately what we know from the Alaska meeting is that Putin, for example, made some sort of territorial swap required. Essentially, one of the things there is that Donetsk would essentially become fully Russian. And Ukraine would see that. And Ukraine would then in turn get some relief on some of the front lines in Kyiv and Zaporizhia. But largely Russia would also maintain control of quite a bit of what they already currently control. Despite the fact that Ukraine that Russia occupies territory in Donetsk, but Ukraine is trying to liberate that territory, they still control quite a bit of Donetsk as well. The issue is, this would then lead, for example, if Donetsk was to be ceded all the way to Russia, there's a notable sort of defensive perimeter around sort of Donetsk that makes it very difficult then. Should this then turn into a hot war again, let's just say there is a ceasefire, there's a peace, but war happens again. It's much harder for Ukraine to then liberate Donetsk. It's much easier for Russia to then launch an offensive. And on top of that, we also know what is happening in all of the Russian-occupied territories, which is extensive Russification. So it also then complicates both the ability to liberate one, but it also rewards Russia essentially by allowing territorial swaps and essentially saying, you committed this aggressive act, here you go, and they would gain a bit. What's also been clear with all of that is that Russia refuses to then also give up its claims to Zaporizhia, to the Donbass, to Crimea, all of the areas that they have annexed. Because constitutionally they can't. Ukraine has the same issue as well. But they have already said that that's not even a starter as well. So there's still going to be these claims to these territories that the Russians are not going to give up. So that's part one. Part two is that Ukraine has wanted security guarantees. Well, Russia has already said NATO countries can't be involved for that. And if at any time that NATO countries or European nations have been mentioned, there is a Russian veto involved. So if we go back to the 2022 negotiations, one of the things that was being discussed was essentially there would be a group of countries that would guarantee Ukraine's sovereignty and independence. But Russia could just say, no, we're not going to allow them to be involved and essentially veto any help for Ukraine. They still want some degree of a veto over when Ukraine could appeal to other countries for their security guarantees. And then finally, on top of that, is that you have then the issue of the military. Zelensky made clear on that Monday meeting in the White House that Ukraine wants a strong military to deter further attack. Well, Russia wants a Ukrainian military that is much smaller, that is has fewer soldiers, may not have the best munitions, and again, largely would be reduced to essentially being a neutral state with some degree of, again, the bare minimum of an army. But again, so Russia could then potentially either reinvade, or what all this sort of amounts to is Russia wants a situation where if there's a peace treaty, essentially it can still destabilize Ukraine in some way. Either it can't then defend itself militarily, it can't rely on other nations to protect itself, or it loses a notable defensive area, along with the fact that we know that this would all be unpopular to the Zelensky government should he agree to all of this. The hope would then be this leads to an election, this leads to a Russian candidate that could be backed by the Kremlin, and that potentially that would be one way they get their Kremlin-backed president in Ukraine, which would then lead to a Belarus situation, for example, or a situation that they had under Viktor Yanukovych, where they aligned much more to Russia. essentially at the end of the day is all of these steps that Russia has sort of put forward are either non-starters for Ukraine because they're not either a serious security guarantee, it's a territorial swap they can't swallow. On top of that, NATO and the EU are, of course, not even starters for the Russians at this point, and that's something that Ukraine would potentially accept. Again, this would have to take some finagling, but one sort of logic for why territorial swaps might be possible is if Europe or NATO says, we will give you membership in return for you making this deal, realizing it's very tough. That might potentially mollify some of the Ukrainian population, but again, that's again a we'll see situation. A long way from that, and of course, the Trump administration has taken NATO membership off the table. So all of this is to say, Russia essentially is trying to figure out a way that if there is a peace, and if they are maybe sort of again see an opportunity where they can get what they want to Ukraine that down the road they can control.
Mother's Day, Father's Day, one day a year to say thank you. But parenting and caregiving, that's every day. Online therapy gives you a space to be heard, to process, to recharge. No commute, no guilt, just support that fits your life. You show up for them, now show up for you. Visit BetterHelp.com for 10% off your first month of online therapy. BetterHelp, therapy for the people who care for everyone else.
The Kremlin's position really has not changed. I think it all comes down to, they've said, we want Ukraine, and they've been really consistent on this. So not to undermine the diplomatic process, but what then would even be the point of engaging Putin in negotiations or even a possible future bilateral meeting?
That's a wonderful question, and I think a lot of it is that part of this is that the Trump administration, I think, entered this very naively. They thought that maybe they might be able to develop this. It's clear that the Trump administration has put some emphasis on Trump's idea as the deal maker in chief, the peacemaker in chief, things like this. And this is just simply put, this is a war that Russia has waged against Ukraine to try to bring Ukraine under its thumb. It has imperialistic elements. It has genocidal elements. And ultimately, the other challenge is that now that we've sort of seen, we've gotten to this point where it's now dragged on for 3.5 years, the escalation at least, is with, again, the Ukraine supporters not providing everything they needed earlier enough that they could really take advantage of some of the gains that they sort of made on the battlefield in 2022 and into 2023. Now that it's in this sort of grinding, more drone war, airstrikes, a very grinding war on the ground, that appears to be a stalemate, Russia feels that it can just outlast Ukraine in the West, one, but also Europe can't alone provide Ukraine enough to keep going. Plus, then there's the issue of manpower. And so we're in this situation where this is going to be just a grinding slog in which ultimately a peace agreement can only happen in a couple of ways, at least from my perspective. Either one, somehow Putin gets everything he wants, which again would be very disastrous to Ukraine, or essentially Ukraine is given enough to push Russian forces back enough that it makes either the war unpopular in Russia, it leads to some domestic strife, economic sanctions finally start to hit enough people that they are willing to then actively protest the regime, and Putin's regime potentially might be challenged in some way. If all of that happens, then there might be a chance that there might be at least a willingness to actually negotiate. The problem is there's no, from Putin's side, there's been very little leverage that really makes it worthwhile. And ultimately, one of the other challenges right now is Trump has made threats that he will extend extensive sanctions against Russia, potentially partner nations that are also supporting Russia. But then he backs out at some point, or we had this meeting in Alaska. So again, Russia is realizing, well, what if we call their bluff? And so we're in this situation where in the 7 months that the Trump administration has been in power, again, it's hard to believe it's only been 7 months. But again, I think what it has come down to is if there was any hope for some sort of mediation, let's just say Trump and Putin, they have that good relationship, there was an actual chance at something real there. It was quickly then sort of squandered in the sense that Putin and Russia and Ukraine both realize, okay, there's no movement, there's no serious desire to actually have peace here. Putin's not going to gain economically by ending the war in the sense that he might even get certain agreements with the Trump administration without making that step, depending on how things go. They're basically, again, involving themselves with the Trump administration and seeing what they can get and saying the right things. And what that has led to is this situation where you have these peace negotiations that virtually everyone knows aren't really going anywhere. But you're at least seeing, again, Europe is planning for, if there's a peace, this is what we're going to be able to offer, which I think is a notable step and an important one. Canada's involved with that, those efforts as well. But at the same time, none of that's bringing an end to the war. And I think this is sort of the issue, is that Putin's not interested and Zelensky can't make certain decisions without hurting his own base. So,
Yet Trump's earlier warnings have really proven to be hollow because, as you mentioned, Putin is facing no immediate concern for further penalty. As you mentioned earlier, he's kind of had a free hand to continue his war against Ukraine. Is that then the more likely play here, that, Russia is just trying to outlast Ukraine for as long as until it becomes completely untenable?
Yes, very simply, yes. And until there's either enough leverage put on Putin or the Russian government in some way for them to reconsider it. Again, even just the fact that we've had extensive terror bombing of Ukraine through the month of July, over the month of August, while these peace talks have been sort of developing. And essentially what has happened is Trump's threatened to do more, but ultimately it's come down to him just showing his displeasure with this. And again, it's led to this situation where, well, if there's no consequences, one of the other things that's sort of come out this week is that there's been at least there's some movement in the Russian government to pull out of the Council of Europe's anti-torture treaty. Now, granted, they're still part of the UN's treaty of anti-torture, but it's one of those symbols where it says, we know what Russian forces have done. There's been extensive reports of torture. It suggests that Russia is in many ways acting with impunity and realizes there's no real consequences to their actions. And that just means that they can continue to do what they've been doing and to terrorize Ukrainians.
For Ukraine's allies, Canada and European leaders in particular, how do they strike a balance, between defending Ukraine's demands for a ceasefire, of course, security guarantees, defending its territorial integrity, but also not antagonizing the U.S. president?
That's going to be a challenge, and I think we're starting to see some fault lines that seem to be sort of developing again, particularly with the Trump administration's focus on certain web policies and things like this with Europe. There's a lot of sort of wondering about whether or not there might be some clashes that have nothing to do with necessarily Russia's war in Ukraine, but with broader concerns, security concerns in Europe and or with Canada. I think the issue is right now, Trump. It's you almost have to read him day to day. It's clear that at least Zelensky and many European leaders have learned how to at least talk to him in some way and at least get his ear. And that was evident from that Monday meeting, just like we saw with Putin is able to sort of, again, say the right things. And Trump will then, for example, we saw in in interviews Trump made afterwards, how Putin was commenting on American domestic affairs in ways that Trump would agree with. It's clear that, again, leaders have learned how to deal with Trump, at least on the personal level. At the same time, things change pretty much every 24 hours, and it's very challenging for nations to be able to, again, develop a policy. I think ultimately, Canada, European nations that have supported Ukraine have done a very good job of at least being consistent. They have stated why they believe that a ceasefire is a necessary first step. They have developed the idea of a sort of either peacekeeping or at least some form of security guarantees. They are actively working with what at least the Trump administration is putting out there for what they want to do. They're trying to show themselves as reliable partners with the hope that Russia's sort of taking advantage of this process and maybe calling some of the Trump administration's bluffs might eventually backfire. Again, it's one of those things where a month from now we could be talking about a very different thing. Again, in 7 months, we've seen so much yo-yoing in terms of where the Trump administration stands with regards to both Ukraine and with Russia. I think ultimately that's what they have to do, is stay consistent in what their policies are, believe that they're doing the right thing, and focus on doing what they can to help Ukraine. Ultimately, that support is going to be one thing that hopefully will allow Ukraine to continue to defend itself, at least for the short term. Again, there's going to probably be some questions long term, because one of the big sort of concerns is right now the United States is allowing NATO nations to buy American weapons that then Ukraine can then they could then donate to Ukraine, or Ukraine can buy. But there's already been reports that the United States won't allow Ukraine to use those weapons to attack Russian targets in Russian territory. And there's always been the concern that Trump might pull that proviso as well. And ultimately, you just have to sort of focus on what you have today and hope that sort of things stay consistent. And that's going to be a challenge. That's just going to be the challenge of dealing with the Trump administration, I think, going forward.
On the question again of a possible ceasefire or security guarantees, do you see any of that coming into fruition in the near future?
I would be surprised. I would be shocked if it happened. I use this sort of way, but I'll believe it when I see it. Partially because, again, Russia has never seriously actually engaged with the process. This is not to say that diplomacy isn't happening. We've clearly seen it with some of the prisoner swaps. We saw it previously with regards to the grain deals that Russia eventually pulled out of. There have been moments where, again, there has been some movement on certain issues, but they're minor issues at the end of the day. The big issue is that ultimately, until either Putin sees a reason to actually legitimately negotiate, or Ukraine is in such dire straits that they're forced to accept a deal that is going to be devastating, the reality is this is probably going to continue going for the foreseeable future.
So no diplomatic off-ramp for this war, you don't think, at least right now?
Most likely not. And ultimately, if there is a diplomatic off-ramp, let's just say for Putin, the issue is that Europeans are very concerned about the security implications for that. We've already seen, for example, Russia engaging in various forms of hybrid warfare, flying Air Force planes over the Baltics and things like this. We've seen them see what they can get away with. And then on top of that, there are reports of, again, Russian forces, special forces, attempting assassinations, attempting various property damage, things like this in European nations to, again, destabilize Europe in some way. European security concerns are going to be the key thing for Europe. And the issue is that, unfortunately, for Europe, in the United States, they're much farther away. And it seems also that in some cases, they're not taking them as seriously as obviously Europe is. And one of the things is that I've noticed, even when I've had the opportunity to do some traveling in Europe and to talk to scholars and things, and you can tell that the war is ever present in a lot of ways because it's, again, so much closer. And that's why a diplomatic off-ramp is seen as so hazardous, especially for many European nations, because it essentially tells Putin, you can get away with this. And they're concerned about what does that then mean down the road.
What are the biggest concerns going forward then?
I think the biggest concern ultimately is that the issue of justice is sort of in the background. It's clearly there when you hear statements from European leaders. Obviously, Zelensky, the Prime Minister has also said the same thing. I fear, though, that in many cases, though, with this sort of the peace process that we've seen develop over the last couple of months, the issue of justice has sort of gone away in terms of instead, okay, we just need to focus on getting some sort of agreement down. And we just need to get these two leaders in the room and magically it will all figure itself out. The problem is that we have seen the extensive war crimes and atrocities that Russian forces have committed. There is genocidal intent, if not a genocide, happening here. I consider it a genocide. The abduction of children alone meets the definition of the UN Convention. But also we've seen the extensive Russification in Russian-occupied territories. There is ethnic cleansing happening. There is genocidal intent behind all of this. And ultimately there's going to be generational trauma. There's going to be a need for healing. And ultimately, if there is no form of either justice, which is incredibly unlikely, Russia doesn't recognize the ICC. So again, those arrest warrants, unless Putin happens to arrive in a nation that that has signed the Rome Statute and then is willing to also enforce it, there probably will not be any sort of real justice there. And ultimately, you then have a situation where if there is a peace agreement with no form of restitution, no form of justice, those feelings aren't going to go away just because you wish it. And ultimately, I think that's going to be the biggest sort of long-term concern is that's also what's going to potentially motivate continued animus between Ukraine and Russia. But it's also going to be something that's going to motivate either desire for liberation of Ukrainian territory, but also potentially continue to sour relations between Russia and Ukraine regardless of how things develop. Because if there isn't that sort of reconciliation, reparations, restitution, something that is considered justice, this isn't going away anytime soon. And this will define, at the very least, a generation of how Ukrainians and Russians sort of interact, broadly speaking.
Okay, I will leave it on that very poignant note. Professor Drachevich, really appreciate your analysis today. Thank you.
Thank you again for having me on.
That was The Big Story. You can send us feedback on this episode or any other episode by emailing us at hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca or leave a voicemail at 416-935-5935. You can find us on the Seeker app or on all your favorite podcast players. Please rate, review, follow, and share. I'm Caryn Ceolin. Thanks for listening.
Mother's Day, Father's Day. One day a year to say thank you. But parenting and caregiving, that's every day. Online therapy gives you a space to be heard, to process, to recharge. No commute, no guilt, just support that fits your life. You show up for them, now show up for you. Visit BetterHelp.com for 10% off your first month of online therapy. BetterHelp, therapy for the people who care for everyone else.